call came in on a Tuesday morning just after 7. I remember because the news was on, some weather report about a cold front moving through Ohio, and my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. Area code 614, Columbus. I almost let it go to voicemail. Mr. Aldrich, a man's voice. Flat, professional. This is Detective Sorensen with the Columbus Division of Police. I need to ask you a few questions about a harassment complaint that's been filed against you. I was sitting in a recliner at the Riverside Rehabilitation Center on the 4th floor, wearing a hospital gown and compression socks, with a drainage tube still connected to my left side from the surgery I'd had 6 days earlier. I said, "I'm sorry, what kind of complaint?" He said, "Workplace harassment. Multiple incidents. The complainant says you've been following her, calling her repeatedly, showing up at her office. She's listed 7 specific dates over the past 3 weeks. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just sat there with the television muted now, looking at the gray January light coming through the window, trying to understand what I was hearing." "Detective," I said finally, "I've been in a rehabilitation facility since January 3rd. I had open-heart surgery on the 2nd. I haven't left this building." There was a pause on his end. "Sir, the complaint was filed this morning by a mistress." "I know who filed it," I said, and I did. Before he even finished the sentence, I already knew. My wife and I had been married for 22 years. I was 63 when all of this happened. She was 58. We had a house in Westerville, a golden retriever named Buck, and what I genuinely believed, was a quiet, stable life built on decades of shared decisions. I retired early from my position as a senior logistics coordinator at a freight company outside Columbus. 29 years. I had a pension, a 401k that I'd been careful with, Social Security that I'd decided to defer until 65. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. Comfortable in the way that you earn slowly, year after year, without drama. My wife had gone back to work about 4 years before all of this. She took a position as an administrative coordinator at a mid-sized commercial real estate firm downtown. She seemed happy about it. I was happy for her. The kids were grown. The house was paid down. It made sense for her to have something of her own again. I noticed the distance gradually, the way you notice a draft. Not all at once, but slowly, until one day you realize the room has been cold for a while and you just got used to it. She started staying later at the office. Weeknights, sometimes Saturdays. She'd come home distracted, her phone face down on the kitchen counter, lighting up with notifications she'd clear without showing me. I told myself it was a demanding job. I told myself it was a dominating job. I told myself she was adjusting to a new professional environment after years away from it. I told myself a lot of things that year. The argument that started everything happened in December, about 3 weeks before my surgery. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, and I asked, plainly, if there were something she needed to tell me. I didn't accuse her of anything. I asked. She looked at me across the table and said, "You've been acting paranoid for months." "I've been asking questions," I said. "That's the same thing," she said. We went to bed without resolving anything. That was December 11th. I remember the date because I wrote it in a small notebook I kept in my nightstand. Just a line, just the date and the word dinner, because I had started keeping track of things. Not obsessively, quietly. The way a man does when he knows something is wrong but can't yet name what it is. On December 28th, my cardiologist called and told me the results of my stress test from 2 weeks earlier were concerning enough that he wanted me to come in. I went in on the 30th. He referred me to a cardiac surgeon. On January 2nd, I had a triple bypass at Ohio Health Riverside Methodist Hospital. My wife drove me to the hospital. She sat with me the morning of the surgery. She was there when I woke up in the ICU. After that, I didn't see much of her. She visited twice in the first 6 days. Brief visits. She said she had work obligations, end-of-year reporting, things she couldn't push back. She brought me a card the second time, one of those generic get-well cards from a drugstore. She signed it with her name. Not love. Just her name. I was in no condition to process what that meant. I was 63 years old with a chest held together by wire and staples. Trying to get through the breathing exercises the respiratory therapist left me twice a day. I didn't have the bandwidth for anything beyond the next hour. And then Detective Sorensen called. After I got off the phone with him, he told me he'd be in touch, that this was still a preliminary inquiry. I sat very still for a long time. The weather report finished, a morning talk show came on. I turned the television off. I thought about the 7 dates he'd mentioned. He hadn't given them to me specifically, but he said the complaint covered incidents from the past 3 weeks. I had been in this facility since January 3rd. Before that, I was in the hospital from January 2nd. Before that, December 28th, I was at my cardiologist's office. The last week of December, I had barely left the house. I was exhausted from the pre-surgical testing, the consultations, the blood work. I was not following anyone anywhere. I called my son. He lives in Cincinnati with his wife and their 2 kids. He's 40 years old, works in corporate insurance, and is one of the most level-headed people I've ever known. When I explained what had happened, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Dad, do not talk to anyone else without a lawyer." He was right, of course. But I want to be honest about something. My first instinct wasn't panic. It was grief. Because in the time between hanging up with the detective and calling my son, I had already understood what this was. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. This was architecture. Someone had built something carefully, with dates and statements and a formal complaint, and they had built it to point at me. The only person who would do that was someone who needed me to look dangerous. And the only reason my wife would need me to look dangerous was if she needed to be the one who looked afraid. My son drove up from Cincinnati that afternoon. He found a family law attorney named Mr. Caldwell who agreed to meet with us the following morning. That night, my son sat in the chair beside my hospital bed, and we made a list together. Every place I had been, every appointment, every receipt, every interaction that could be documented from the past month. The list was, in its way, almost absurdly complete. December 12th, follow-up with my primary care physician. Appointment record, time-stamped. December 17th, pharmacy pickup at the CVS on Schrock Road. Receipt with timestamp. Security camera. December 22nd, cardiac stress test at the imaging center on Olentangy River Road. Medical record. December 28th, cardiologist office, referred for surgery. Medical record. December 30th, pre-surgical consultation at Riverside Methodist. Medical record. January 2nd, admitted for surgery at 5:45 a.m. Surgical record, anesthesia record, ICU admission record. January 3rd to the date of the call, continuous admission at Riverside Rehabilitation. Nursing notes, physical therapy logs, daily vital signs. I had not been in any office building downtown. I had not called anyone from a number other than my own. I had not followed anyone anywhere. I had been for the past 3 weeks either hospitalized or in a medical facility with documented check-ins every 6 to 8 hours. Mr. Caldwell reviewed everything the next morning and said, very calmly, "This complaint has no legs." Then he paused and said, "But we should understand why it was filed." That took a few more weeks to understand fully. My son, to his credit, didn't wait for lawyers to figure it out. He was meticulous in a way I've always admired. He requested copies of our joint bank statements. I was still on the account, still had full access, and went through the past 8 months, line by line. What he found wasn't a smoking gun. It was more like a slow leak. There were cash withdrawals. Not large ones, nothing dramatic. 200 here, 300 there, occasionally 500. Regular enough to suggest intention, spread out enough to avoid attention. Over 8 months, it added up to just under $11,000. Money that had moved quietly out of our checking account and into something I had no visibility into. There were also transfers to an account I didn't recognize. Small ones, the kind of amounts that individually wouldn't raise a flag. $40, $75, $120. But they were consistent every 10 to 14 days. My son cross-referenced the dates of those transfers with what he could find on my wife's work schedule. He still had access to a shared calendar she hadn't thought to remove him from, and every single transfer happened on a day she had marked herself as working late. I don't know the man's name. My attorney advised me not to pursue that specifically, and I took his advice. What I know is what the financial record showed, what the calendar showed, and what the complaint that had been filed against me showed, that someone was trying to build a story in which I was unstable, threatening, and dangerous. The kind of story that makes a judge in a divorce proceeding look at a wife and see a victim. It almost worked. Mr. Caldwell filed a formal response to the complaint within the week. Attached were 94 pages of documentation, surgical records, nursing notes, physical therapy attendance logs, security badge records from the rehabilitation center showing every time my room door had been scanned, pharmacy receipts, appointment confirmations going back to early December. He also filed a separate document flagging the financial discrepancies and requesting a forensic review of the joint accounts as part of anticipated divorce proceedings. Detective Sorensen called me one more time, about 10 days after the first call. He said the complaint had been reviewed by his supervisor and was being closed as unsubstantiated. He said it in a very neutral, administrative way. He didn't apologize. He didn't comment on the nature of the complaint or who had filed it. He just said the case was closed and wished me well. I thanked him and hung up. That afternoon, I did the breathing exercises. I walked the hall with my physical therapist, 40 feet down, 40 feet back, which was still an effort at that point, and I thought about what the word unsubstantiated actually meant in that context. It meant impossible. It meant that not one of the 7 alleged incidents could have occurred, because I was, on every one of those dates, documented by medical staff as being in a building I could not have left without being noticed. Unsubstantiated was a generous word for what had been done. I was discharged from the rehabilitation center in late January. My son and his wife came up to drive me home. When we pulled into the driveway, my wife's car was not there. It hadn't been there when my son checked the day before either. She had taken what she wanted. I found that out later doing a room-by-room inventory, and gone. She had left Buck, though. He was in the backyard, perfectly fine with food and water, but clearly confused. He came to the door and sat against my legs while I stood in the kitchen trying to get my bearings. I was grateful for the dog in a way I'm not sure I can fully explain. The divorce proceedings took 14 months. I won't go through all of it, not because it's painful, though parts of it were, but because the mechanics of it are less interesting than people imagine. What matters is this. The forensic accountant my attorney hired found the full picture of the financial transfers. What had been moved over 8 months without my knowledge totaled closer to $17,000 when you included accounts I hadn't initially found. My wife had consulted a divorce attorney in October, we later discovered, 3 months before my surgery, well before she would have known about my cardiac issues. She had been planning a departure. The harassment complaint was, as best as anyone could determine, an attempt to establish a narrative, to get ahead of any accusation of wrongdoing on her part by making me the problem first. If a woman files a harassment complaint against her husband in December, and then the marriage dissolves in January, the sequence looks a certain way to a family court judge. It looks like a woman leaving a dangerous man, except that the husband had been in open-heart surgery on 2 of the 7 dates listed in the complaint, and in a cardiac ICU on 3 others, and in a rehabilitation facility, monitored around the clock for the rest. The judge in our case was a woman in her late 50s who had clearly seen a great many things in family court when Mr. Caldwell presented the full documentation, including the timeline showing that the harassment complaint had been filed on a date when I was physically incapable of having committed any of the alleged acts. She looked at the paperwork for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at my wife's attorney. Then she said, "Counsel, I'd like to take a recess." That recess lasted 40 minutes. When we came back, the terms of the settlement shifted considerably. I won't say what they were. That's between me and my attorney and whatever peace I've managed to make with all of it. But I will say that the forensic accounting played a significant role, and the harassment complaint played a role in an entirely different direction than the one it had been intended to. My wife did not face criminal charges for filing a false police report. Her attorney argued that she had filed in good faith based on her perception of my behavior in the weeks prior to my hospitalization. The detective's decision to close the case rather than escalate it meant there was no formal finding of bad faith. My attorney discussed with me the possibility of pursuing a civil claim. I decided against it. I made that decision for a simple reason. I was 63 years old and I had just had open heart surgery, and I was not going to spend the next 2 years of my life in litigation. I had survived something. The surgery, yes, but also the other thing. The thing you survive when someone you built a life with turns out to have been building something else alongside it without you. I was not going to let the wreckage take any more years than it already had. Buck and I moved into a smaller house in a different part of Westerville that spring. Ranch style, 1 floor, good for a man who is still doing cardiac rehab twice a week and prefers not to think about stairs. The neighborhood is quiet. There's a park 2 blocks away where Buck can run. My son calls on Sundays. My daughter-in-law sends me things in the mail sometimes, articles she thinks I'd like. Once a jar of the hot sauce I'd mentioned offhand that I couldn't find locally anymore. Small things. They matter. I have a cardiologist I see every 4 months. My numbers are good. Better than they were before the surgery, honestly, which my cardiologist says is common but still manages to surprise me every time I hear it. I think about the morning of that phone call sometimes. Not obsessively, the way you think about a near miss. Not because it's still happening, but because it clarifies something. Because it shows you the distance between what almost was and what actually is. I was lying in a rehabilitation bed with a drainage tube in my side and compression socks on my legs, and the morning news playing on a television I could barely reach the remote for. That was the moment someone chose to file a police complaint naming me as a stalker. Whoever calculated that move, whatever they thought it would accomplish, they did not account for the paper trail that a triple bypass leaves behind it. They did not account for nursing notes and surgical records and physical therapy logs, and a son who worked in corporate insurance and knew how to read a financial document. They did not account for 94 pages. I am not a man who believes in dramatic statements or big conclusions. I spent 29 years moving freight from one place to another on schedule. I raised 2 kids, paid a mortgage, drove sensible cars, and tried to do things the right way without expecting a trophy for it. I am not built for speeches, but I will say this. The truth is not always loud. Sometimes it just sits there, in a manila folder on an attorney's table, and lets the math speak. The math spoke. I didn't need it to shout. I just needed it to be there. And it was. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Cardiac rehab gives you that. Twice a week, walking on a treadmill at a pace that would embarrass most people, with nothing to do but think. And what I keep coming back to isn't the anger, though there was anger. It's the sequence, the way one thing leads to another, whether you intend it to or not. My wife made choices. Small ones at first, then larger ones, then a final one that required her to file a police complaint naming me as a harasser while I was lying in a hospital bed with my chest opened up. That's the end point of a long chain of decisions, each one requiring the next. And what I've come to understand is that the chain doesn't lie. You can lie to a detective. You can lie to a detective. You can lie to a judge. You can lie to yourself for years about what kind of person you're becoming. But the chain of what you've actually done, that doesn't lie. It just sits there, patient, waiting to be read. I am not a man who believes that people get what they deserve in any automatic, cosmic sense. I've lived long enough to know that plenty of people do wrong things and walk away clean. But I do believe this. The more elaborate the deception, the more it depends on everything going right. My wife's plan required me to have no alibi. It required the dates she chose to be undocumentable. It required me to be the kind of man who doesn't keep records, doesn't have a son who knows how to read a financial statement, doesn't have a cardiologist who dates every note. She did not account for 94 pages. That's the thing about building something on a lie. You have to keep building. You have to patch every gap, account for every variable, stay ahead of every question. And most people can do that for a while. But a triple bypass leaves a paper trail that no amount of careful planning can erase. The surgery happened. The nursing notes happened. The physical therapy logs happened. Truth, when it's documented, doesn't need anyone to defend it. It just needs to be found. What I've learned, not from this situation specifically, but from 63 years of living and the last 2 of recovering, is that integrity isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's just the slow accumulation of doing the right thing when nobody's watching, keeping records when it seems unnecessary, telling the truth when a comfortable lie would be easier. I kept that notebook in my nightstand not because I suspected I'd need it in court. I kept it because I was a man trying to understand what was happening in his own marriage, honestly, without flinching from it. That habit, the habit of honest accounting, was ultimately what protected me. Not luck. Not a clever attorney, though Mr. Caldwell was excellent. Not the fact that I happened to have surgery during the relevant dates. It was 29 years of being a man who keeps his paperwork straight, pays attention to the details, and doesn't look away from things that are uncomfortable. My son learned that from somewhere. The way he sat in that hospital chair with a legal pad and went through 8 months of bank statements line by line. That's a thing you learn by watching someone do it first. I'd like to think he watched me. Buck is asleep under my chair as I write this. The neighborhood is quiet. My numbers are good. Some mornings that's enough, and honestly, most mornings, it's more than enough.